Hello again. I'd like to talk briefly about some of the key ideas in the material on taking discussion online. And Dr. Broyles has a packet of paper handouts for you. Those are also scanned and appear on the Moodle site as D1. And there are some other great resources labeled D2 through 6 that I will refer to as I briefly speak. Well, what I'd like to do is set up a little bit of the groundwork about expectations, both your expectations and the expectations of the students, and what the instructor can do to make the most of both of those and perhaps shape the expectations of the students in a beneficial way. One of the funny things you have on the top of your paper handout stack is a list of types of students in online classes, and they're expressed as animals. So you have the squirrel who's always catching up and then disappearing, and you have the rabbit who chats all the time online. You have the elephant who shows up a little bit every day and does everything and is very predictable, etc. And you're going to have all of these students in your online discussion sections. You know which ones you are in an online discussion section, and all of those students have very different expectations for how they're going to conduct themselves online and what they're trying to accomplish. One of the things I would suggest is a very helpful thing to think about is stating ground rules for students and helping them understand your expectations. And then secondly, building out over the course of a class a series of online activities that gradually take students from less experienced to more experienced online participants. And if you pull up D2, Designing E-tivities, on your Moodle page, there's a very helpful set of resources there called the 5-step model for E-tivities. So you can actually buy this book, and I really would recommend it if you end up teaching online, because it has some wonderful ideas about how to engage students with each other as well as with you through discussions online. If you will look initially at the tab at the top called E-tivities, there's a little definition there talking about E-tivities, which is really a fancy and more extensive way of thinking about what one could do with forums in an online discussion, as interactivity between students, other learners, and other participants, which may be you or perhaps a guest, designed and led, so before and during, by an e-moderator, which is you, the faculty member. They're asynchronous, they take place over time, so an E-tivity could take place over the course of a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, which means that you need to be able to give students kind of punctuated due dates, and you need to segment the E-tivity so different things are being done in time for students to then review and make a secondary comment, for example, on the initial material that students have found. There's a term that she uses under key features of activities that I think is very helpful, and it's the term spark. And it's part of the instructions that you would give students to help them get going on an activity, and we'll talk about that further in a moment. So you might think about setup for an activity as not just including discussion questions like we've already talked about in a face-to-face environment, but setting a stage. And a spark could create a scenario, it could throw out some resources, it could do more than just list a question for students to respond to, and it could be the beginning stage in an inquiry that a group of students could undertake over the course of time, 1 week to 3 weeks, something of that sort. One of the cautions, and if you click on her tab called the 5-stage model, this is still in resource 2D, you'll see that students aren't ready to jump in at the high end. This little model of stair steps is very similar to what we've talked about as developmental learning theory, that students first come in and their main issues are being motivated, to do the objective, to do the task, being able to get on the forum and not experience technical problems, then socialization, getting to know people in the group, then finally contributing information and exchanging information, and finally the top two levels, which are more like the top levels of Bloom's taxonomy as you're figuring out, are knowledge construction, where using what they know and what other students know, they can pull some things together, and finally pulling in materials outside the class beyond what you provided for them. And you can see that in her little chart there's a lot more technical support required and a lot more e-moderating support required at the lower levels, or the beginning levels, of the 5-stage model. She's got some good discussion of those stages, and I would recommend that you take a look at them. If you'll flip back to your handout, your paper handout, there is one sheet there called Building Eativities, Key Principles. And one of the things that this does is to suggest how you lay out expectations for students. And I would say two things. One is you need to be very specific as to the length of what they need to contribute, the frequency with which they need to interact with other students, the number of other students they need to interact with, the number of external resources they bring to bear on a discussion or an eativity. And this sheet lays out some interesting things to think about. One of those is number 6, timing and pacing. Not only for the eativity as a whole, but also for what they would do from Monday to Wednesday and what they would do from Wednesday to Friday, that would then prepare them to come back as a group and look at contributions of other folks to the group. One of the other helpful things on this sheet is item 12, detailing what should be in the initial instructional message. And note that the students are being told the purpose of the eativity, so they know what they're supposed to get out of it, and as well as how they go about doing it, the time-sensitive nature of it, when it should start, when it should stop, intermediate deadlines, and what the responsibilities of the students are in working with each other. That brings up an interesting point, and that's the term netiquette. And if you will go back to Moodle and pull up D5, the core rules of netiquette, one of the things that students may not be altogether familiar with is types of behavior that are acceptable and not acceptable in the online environment, and even maybe not extremely offensive to other students, but bothersome. And I think one of your jobs as the person setting up the eativity as well as moderating the eativity is to ensure that students have a safe environment and they are not guessing as to how they are to behave in the online environment. So I think it's fairly common for instructors to refer students to some basic netiquette rules. Our computer statement that students sign at SNU ask them to look those over. So there may be some institutional netiquette responsibilities that students have already agreed to as being part of your institution. But I do think not every time that you give them instructions, but certainly the first time in the course, you want to create that safe environment. A couple of other things to consider. As I mentioned, questions are not always the best way to start students off with an activity. Sometimes it's a task and then sharing information gleaned from that task. Sometimes it is a general discussion question, and in that case many of the characteristics of good discussion questions that we've already discussed would certainly apply. Another thing to think about is what your role as the instructor is in moderating or guiding or shaping or responding to the discussion as it unfolds. And that term moderator is really the term that describes that particular role that you're undertaking, which means you can't be like that squirrel and disappear for the 3 weeks of the eativity. You've got to show up and occasionally respond to students. Maybe if they're stuck, ask a question to get them back online or get them back in the task stream of the assignment. So here in your handout there is a sheet that says, this is the paper handouts, key tasks for e-moderators of eativities. That sometimes the instructor needs to step in the moderator role and pull together things that students have contributed that you know are all important in leading to the final goal, but the students don't know enough to realize that yet. So you could point out relationships or ask students to comment on relationships. That would be kind of like asking leading questions in a way. You can also summarize at the end of the activity, at midpoints of the activity, to turn people from what they've done to the next stage. And then it's your responsibility to archive the activity when it's concluded. One of the other things that you want to be sensitive to is a type of feedback, and having some logical grading scheme for these kinds of activities other than just participation, so that you can assess quality and contribution. And you have two handouts at the end of your packet that give you some examples of ways to say things to students that are probably the most effective ways to deal with issues as they come up, and some very ineffective ways to deal with issues as they come up. And I always remember that whatever goes in email to a student may go to a department chair or a dean or a parent or the president of the college. So you need to be well aware that whatever you put in an email to students needs to be short, clear, to the point, and judicious in what you say, non-accusatory, advisory, and very carefully worded and judicious. The final thing to think about is how in the world you're going to evaluate these discussions. And you have one set of information in the last page of your paper handout that is helpful to you in seeing a possible way. You also have under D6 in discussions a discussion board evaluation looking at sample rubrics, and there are many sample rubrics online. I would certainly make sure that the students knew in advance how they would be evaluated on the discussion, so they know whether they've written a sufficient amount, or they've appeared frequently enough, or they've met the internal deadlines, or provided enough examples, or whatever it is that you're going to require of them. I find that designing forums and discussion boards and activities takes a lot of time, and following up with students takes a lot of time. So you may not want to do an excessive number of these. Maybe go for quality instead of quantity, and something that's memorable and illustrative for the students that will help them better understand, maybe take them to those higher levels of critical thinking, and be something they can remember from the course. Thank you.